I've been absolutely clear with President Putin. He has no misunderstanding. If any assembled Russian units move across the Ukrainian border, that is an invasion. But it will be met with severe and coordinated economic response that I've discussed in detail with our allies, as well as laid out very clearly for President Putin. But there is no doubt, let there be no doubt at all, that if Putin makes this choice, Russia will pay a heavy price.
A year into his administration, Biden raises the stakes in his confrontation with Putin over Ukraine by threatening swift and severe action against Russia as the U.S. puts thousands of troops on high alert and the White House focuses on what it calls diplomacy, deterrence, and defense. Hello, I'm Ghida Fakhry. Welcome to the program. As tensions between Washington and Moscow over Ukraine continue to escalate, the Pentagon has placed 8,500 US-based troops on heightened alert for possible quick deployment to undisclosed locations around Russia. This follows talks last week between US Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, who failed to reach an agreement. The White House is now weighing the option of deploying troops to Poland, Romania, and other NATO countries in Eastern Europe in what the Pentagon said was an effort to provide deterrence, while also bolstering the alliance and making sure it remained, quote, unified. The Biden administration also provided an additional $200 million worth of weapons, with 2 shipments already delivered to Ukraine in the past week alone. This follows similar weapons and ammunition deliveries by Spain, France, Estonia, and the UK. The U.S. has sent more than $2.5 billion in military aid to Ukraine since 2014, when Russia annexed Crimea, following an uprising that forced then-President Viktor Yanukovych into exile. In December, U.S. intelligence reported Russia had begun a military buildup on its border with Ukraine. U.S. officials now say that Russia has massed over 127,000 troops along the Russia-Ukraine border. Moscow has officially denied plans to invade Ukraine, accusing the US and NATO of escalating tensions. So, will the ongoing brinkmanship reawaken Cold War demons, and can it lead to a hot war? Is Russia's show of force an attempt to negotiate with the US and NATO from a position of strength? And is the standoff between Washington and Moscow the most serious and dangerous crisis since the fall of the Berlin Wall? Ivo Daalder is a former US ambassador to NATO. He joins me now. Ambassador Daalder, at the heart of this crisis is Russia's demand that NATO not admit Ukraine into the alliance. Russia wants to stop NATO expansion eastward. In the world of realpolitik, is this an unreasonable demand?
Well, it is a reasonable demand from Russia's perspective, but it's an unreasonable demand not only from NATO and Ukraine's perspective, but that of international law. Under international law, independent states can decide their own future. There is no voice, let alone a veto of neighbors for how states decide whether or not to join an alliance. And at the core of this is not just NATO coming closer to Russia's border, it's Russia's determination to make sure that it controls its immediate neighborhood, including independent countries like Ukraine that have been independent and sovereign for over 30 years now.
But is this really about Ukraine's independence and sovereignty? Because everyone knows that NATO is not ready to admit Ukraine or Georgia or Moldova anytime soon. From a strategic, practical perspective, why keep this provocation?
Well, I'm not sure it is a provocation. I think the provocation isn't NATO keeping the door open to Ukraine. The provocation to Putin is having an independent Ukraine that is able to determine its own future, a future that the people in Ukraine and the government successively over the last 8 years have said it lies with the West and not necessarily as a subjugation of Russia. That's the real provocation to Putin. He can't have independent states, let alone vibrant democracies in his neighborhood, because he fears that the same will happen with his own country. And that's really what's at the core of this. It's Putin's uncertainty about his own position of power inside Russia rather than Ukraine's future in or outside of NATO that is at issue.
But Ambassador, this isn't just about Putin. It's about Russia and Russia's place in the world, isn't it? I mean, Russia also wants to ban offensive weapons, including missiles near its border, especially in Ukraine. It wants NATO to withdraw all the military forces, the military infrastructure that it has stationed in 14 of its newest member states, most of them former Warsaw Pact members. It isn't totally unreasonable, is it, considering that the US almost brought the entire world to the brink of nuclear war when it opposed, not on the basis of international law, but on the basis of sheer national vested interest, the deployment of Soviet missiles in Cuba 6 decades ago. Is this a new Cold War?
Well, I hope it's not, and we don't want to have a new Cold War. We want to find a way in which we have a European and indeed a global security environment in which we accept two fundamental realities: that independent states are truly independent, that they can decide their own future, and that borders don't get changed by force. It's not NATO that has done that. It's not NATO that has put forces into Eastern Europe just without any provocation. It didn't happen until Russia invaded Ukraine, annexed a part of the country, and it did so in contravention of an agreement that Russia itself signed in 1994 in return for Ukraine providing the nuclear weapons that remain on its territory when the Soviet Union broke up, to return those to Russia. In return for that, Russia guaranteed the independence and the security of the then existing borders. And that was what was violated. NATO didn't put forces into the Baltic states or Poland until after Russia invaded Ukraine.
But weren't the seeds of today's crisis planted when the US, under the Bush administration in 2008 in Bucharest, encouraged Ukraine and Georgia to join NATO? And in fact, didn't the US break its own promise back in 1990, as you know, and it's been declassified in the National Security Archive, when the United States and then Secretary of State James Baker told the president of Russia, Mikhail Gorbachev, that in return for Soviet cooperation on Germany and German reunification, there would be, quote, guarantees that NATO would not expand an inch eastward. Didn't the US break its promise?
Well, two parts here. The 2008 decisions, of course, the debate in 1990. The debate in 1990 was about the reunification of Germany, and the guarantee that was given with regard to NATO not moving one further inch into East Germany remains, in fact, the case. There was an agreement, and this was signed by the Soviet Union and the United States, and indeed the other allied powers over Germany, that said that the entire territory of Germany would be part of NATO, but that until Russian troops have withdrawn, no NATO forces would move into Eastern Germany. That indeed.
But hold on, Ambassador. I mean, what the transcript says is that Baker said that NATO would not expand 1 inch eastward. In fact, he said this. He said, "We understand that not only for the Soviet Union, but for other European countries as well, it is important to have guarantees that if the US keeps its presence in Germany within the framework of NATO, not an inch of NATO's present military jurisdiction will spread in an eastern direction." There was no formal agreement, but there was clearly an understanding, a quid pro quo.
One, there was no formal agreement, and two, this was a discussion about Germany.
But this was about NATO's expansion, though, Ambassador. It was a guarantee that the US made to the Soviets.
No, into Eastern Germany, and that remains the case. In 1997, NATO and Russia signed an agreement, the Nato-Russia Founding Act, in which NATO said that under the foreseeable security situation, the United States and NATO would not move troops to Eastern Europe. But of course, those situations changed when in 2014 Russia invaded Ukraine. The 2008 decision by NATO to say that Ukraine and Georgia will become members of NATO is a regrettable decision. I've said so many times, including in 2008. It was a decision made to create a compromise among NATO countries, and I think could we do it over again, we wouldn't be in this position. But the fundamental principles remain. Countries should be able to decide their future and not be vetoed for doing so by their neighbors, particularly when those neighbors are stronger, particularly when they have 100,000 troops on their borders. This is not how international affairs should be conducted. And under the circumstances, opposing what Russia is trying to do in Ukraine is the right policy.
But at the end of the day, let's be honest as well, it isn't just about sovereignty and independence and democracy. It's about keeping the central government of Ukraine in the Western Hemisphere. It's also about the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. from Russia to Germany that the US has so publicly been opposed to no avail. But let me also mention this. I mean, when you talk about NATO and its free expansion eastward or to any countries, is it in the US's best national interest, or is keeping NATO membership on the table for some of these smaller countries more of a disservice, a burden?
Well, I think having NATO membership as one of the ways for these countries to change their internal structures has been extraordinarily successful. Much of Central and Eastern Europe was dominated first by the Soviet Union and then part of a world that had a planned economy that was not particularly free. And you ask the people in the Czech Republic or in Slovakia or in Croatia or in Albania or in Poland or indeed in the Baltic states whether the changes that have occurred over the last 30 years as a result of the attractiveness of belonging to NATO and the European Union, because it's not just NATO, it's also the European Union, whether that was not a positive in their lives. And the answer for most of them will be yes. Wouldn't you?
But at the end of the day, though, but hold on, Ambassador, because at the end of the day, hasn't NATO expansion decreased peace and security in Europe rather than increased it? Because, as an example, if NATO or the United States arguably didn't stir the pot over Ukraine, one could argue that Crimea would still be part of Ukraine today.
Yeah, one could. We could also argue that if Russia didn't use military force and invade a country in violation of the UN Charter, after all, as well as the Helsinki Final Act, Crimea would also still be independent. Poles or Estonians or Latvians or Lithuanians surely are better off being members of NATO, particularly with a strong Russian force right at their border, ready to pounce. As indeed a build-up within the Kaliningrad area, which is in between Lithuania and Poland, that the Russians that is still Russian territory. Those are threats that to these countries that are countered by the fact that they're members of NATO. So from that perspective, they think they're more secure, and I think they are right to think so.
All right, former U.S. Ambassador to NATO, Ivo Daalder, thank you so much for joining me.
My pleasure.
Now, meanwhile, some US lawmakers have advocated giving Ukrainian forces more sophisticated military equipment than they are now receiving, including anti-aircraft weapons and fighter jets. While Ukrainian forces remain vastly outmatched by Russia's military, can any US assistance to Ukraine deter a potential Russian invasion? And at what point does the US need to accept that Russia can claim a sphere of influence in Eastern Europe and feel objectively threatened by NATO's eastward expansion? My next guest is retired Brigadier General Peter Zwack, who served as the senior defense attaché to the Russian Federation during the Obama administration. Brigadier General Zwack, you've had first-hand experience in dealing with Russia and Russian military leaders in Moscow. Russia officially says it isn't planning an invasion of Ukraine, even though it has amassed over 100,000 troops right on its border with Ukraine. The Ukrainians, though, are urging calm. So are Europeans. Is the US dramatizing the situation and creating a crisis?
Thank you for bringing me on, and it's a great question, Ghida. I think we're in a really, really dangerous space. While there are always difficult, if you will, relations and perceptions, the Russians have put an extremely muscular and offensively poised force near the Ukrainian border and over an extended front. And the exercise and the rhetoric and a portrayal of the West as a threat, portrayal of Ukraine trying to, threatening the Russian separatists in Donbass. And no, this is really dangerous.
Why not take Putin and the Russians on their word? They have said on many occasions that they weren't interested in invading. In fact, the Russian embassy in DC tweeted this just a few days ago. It says, we stress once again, Russia isn't going to attack anyone. The practice of moving troops on our own soil is a sovereign right. We call to end the hysteria. Is this all too much drama? Is it too much hysteria on the American side?
I would say it is. First of all, I try to speak American and, if you will, European allied side. No, those of us that are old hands, and I was in Moscow in 2014 during the first invasion, um, the Russians were deceptive. They lied when asked, "Are there Russian troops in Crimea?" They lied, "Were there Russian troops in eastern Ukraine in the spring of 2014?" Um, they
But come
were
on, hasn't the US often been deceptive? Isn't it
I think
overreacting by beating the drums of war today?
Ghida, I think that the issues now is that they are maneuvering large elements. And by the way, I want to make it very clear. I have a lot of time in Russia. I have a lot of Russian friends. I fundamentally appreciate the Russian people and culture. But I believe that this course of action by their government, by their regime, is coercive. And in many ways smacks of the type of behaviors that you would see autocrats and authoritarians do in the 30s or times during the Cold War. And it makes everybody nervous. And there are a lot of European countries that also want to try to figure out a way with Russia, but at the same time seeing this aggressive Russian playbook.
But again, you call it aggressive Russian playbook, but I mean, do you believe that the Russians are intent on invading Ukraine? It's one thing to amass troops on the border, it's another to invade the country. And what is the end game for the United States? Because it is also said that it's placing thousands of troops on high alert, ready to deploy them to Eastern Europe.
Very, very simply, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, 30 nations, all who volunteered to be into it, all that want that security guarantee of Article 5. There are a number of those nations that feel really vulnerable right now along the border, if you will, of the East and Ukraine. There are 4 NATO nations that border Ukraine and 3 the Black Sea. They're nervous. They have a very light defensive force structure. The forces that they're talking about going in are not into Ukraine. They're going into these countries if they go, and they are to, if you will, assure the allies and also tell the Russians, if you attack, you're going to kill a bunch of internationals, and then it really, really gets bad.
All right, retired General Peter Zwack, thank you very much for joining me.
Okay, thank you very much, Ghida.
Now, of course, Ukraine is not the only foreign affairs crisis facing the Biden administration. A recent poll shows just 37% of Americans approve of President Biden's handling of foreign policy and US-Russia relations. So how does Biden's handling of this crisis compare to previous presidents? Andrew Bacevich is a historian and president of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. He is Professor Emeritus of International Relations and History at Boston University and is also a retired colonel who served in the US Army. Andrew Bacevich, why is President Biden upping the ante with Russia over Ukraine when he faces so many challenges right here at home? Is it more to do with domestic politics than it has to do with peace and security in Europe? And I guess you could say the same about Prime Minister Boris Johnson in the UK.
Yeah, that's a good question. And frankly, if I had a chance to meet with the president, that's precisely what I would ask him, because it seems to me that his administration is mired in crisis. Americans are very disappointed, not all, most Americans, based on his approval ratings, are very disappointed with what his presidency has produced. And at least from my point of view, it's very difficult to make a persuasive case that Ukraine is a place to draw a line in the sand that could potentially lead to the U.S. involvement in another war, which we certainly do not need at this point in our history.
And just how far do you expect President Biden to take this? Because President Trump issued a statement just a couple of days ago saying this would never have happened under his watch. If you put it all in a historical context, are these things ever down to personalities, personal relationships? Because you've written extensively about America's path to what you called permanent war and how Americans are seduced by war, that war has become normal for the United States? Does it really matter who is president of the US?
Well, of course it does, although I tend to believe that personalities are secondary. And I think this circumstance is illustrative of that fact. I mean, how did we get here? We got here because when the Cold War ended, with the United States and its allies in a position of apparently great strength, and with Russia certainly weak and vulnerable, the NATO alliance exploited that differential in power by recklessly, in my judgment, expanding far to the east. Now, today, the United States is not supreme. Now, today, the United States military has been shown that it can be had. And I think Putin is exploiting a circumstance in order to get back at the United States and its allies. I'm not sticking up for Putin. I think he is to some degree a danger to Europe. But quite frankly, the position that he has taken is understandable given the mistreatment that his country has endured since the fall of the Berlin Wall.
And as you say, the US broke a promise that it made to the Soviet Union back in 1990, when then Secretary of State James Baker told the Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev, in fact on the 9th of February 1990, that the US, in return for Soviet cooperation on the negotiations that were going on that had to do with the unification of Germany, would not expand, quote, 1 inch eastward. Joe Biden, though, has decades of foreign policy experience, as we know. But is he really calling the shots on Ukraine, or is he being pushed into a corner? Because clearly this new crisis in Europe is good, isn't it, for the industrial military complex?
Well, a minute ago, you alluded to the role of domestic politics, and I think there's no question that domestic politics play a very large role in this thing. Perhaps less.
It's also good for the midterms, isn't it?
Well,
It'll
be bad for Biden's expectations in the midterms if he is perceived to be weak. And so it's very important politically that he project an image of strength and determination. I think he's trying to do that. On the other hand, Biden has been very clear that if Russia invades Ukraine, that the U.S. response, and by extension NATO's response, will primarily be economic, that we will impose sanctions. Nothing that Biden has said, and this is an important point, nothing that Biden has said suggests that the United States wants to go to war over Ukraine.
And yet the Ukrainian president has said what he wants is a dialogue with Russia. He says, I want the U.S. to help us to find a format. We support dialogue. We're against war. This isn't really about Ukraine, is it? And when you mention sanctions, it seems that the United States foreign policy has been addicted to sanctions, to try to compel its adversaries, its enemies alike. But the record is clear, though, isn't it? That sanctions, certainly unilateral sanctions, don't work. They haven't worked on Iran. They haven't worked on Iraq, the DPRK, not to mention the 6-year-old embargo on Cuba. Why would the US then believe for a second that the best way ahead with Russia is to impose sanctions and to threaten Russia with new sanctions?
Well, because the alternative is military action. And I think all parties recognize that that alternative is worse. So I imagine that when Biden sits around the table with his advisors and they begin with the premise that the United States can't do nothing, can't afford to look weak, but we don't want war. So what does that leave as options? It leaves economic sanctions, even though, as you suggest, the record of what we get when we impose economic sanctions is not in the least promising.
Andrew Bacevich, really good to get your perspective. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me on.
Now, of course, it's not easy to have a good overview of what is going on, not so much in, but rather over Ukraine, between the United States and Russia. After the virtual Biden-Putin summit in early December and last week's meeting between Blinken and Lavrov, tensions are higher than before, with talk of war and cargoes of military hardware being delivered to Kiev by the US and its NATO allies while Russia continues to move over 100,000 troops along its border with Ukraine. So is war imminent? The Ukrainian president doesn't seem to believe so. Ukraine has been embroiled in a civil war in the Donbas region in the east since 2014 with no end in sight. And so, in short, amid the growing tensions and talk of war, Washington and Moscow's brinkmanship is a dangerous game with a smell of gas in the air. And while NATO's stated objective is to maintain peace and security in Europe, its eastward expansion and declaration in April 2008 at the NATO summit in Bucharest, quote, that we agreed today that these countries will become members of NATO, has undermined it. These countries were no other than the Republic of Georgia, which just a few months later lost Abkhazia and South Ossetia, and Ukraine, which has already lost Crimea, which is now back in Moscow's hands, seemingly for good. Will NATO be forced to realize that sometimes less is more? That's all from me, Ghida Fakhry, and the team. Thanks for watching.